In a lot of respects, it does feel a little bit like an Office episode, if the impacts weren't significant.
One, two, three.
Today, we have the closest thing to an emergency pod that we've had on the Modern Acre podcast, talking to Brian Kuehl, the Director of Government and Public Affairs at Pinion, all about this craziness going on with the USDA and DOGE. The Modern Acre is the podcast for builders in ag who think differently. The Modern Acre podcast is presented by Myland, a soil health company that's revolutionizing agriculture. Through their innovative soil as a service, Myland partners with farmers to improve their soil health with the power of beneficial live native microalgae. The result? Healthier soils, more productive farms, and benefits like smarter water use. Discover how Myland can transform your farm at myland.ag.
Ty, there's so much happening in agriculture right now with USDA and DOGE. Last week, we were talking about it. We're we got to talk about this on the pod. You put up the bat signal on LinkedIn, made a little post about it, went a little viral. Ty, what happened there?
Yeah, Tim, I just took it to the internets and I, just said, I asked, hey, we would love to get someone on the pod that can talk objectively about what's going on. And it got some significant reach. And I think we got our guy. We got a solid person, Brian, to come in educated on everything going on with public policy. He's been in the ag sector for years, working at Pinion. And so we get him on, Tim, to talk about all this craziness going on. And I am super happy with the conversation. We just got done talking with him, and I think hit on a ton of topics. I want to say we probably didn't cover everything. So, we were just trying to get a good lay of the land of objectively, factually, what's happening and what are the potential implications, right? So I think we tried to dissect that with him. I will also point out for the people affected, I think that's super challenging. These are people's lives we're talking about that are having, major changes coming at them. Tim and I both experienced companies that go through layoffs, and it is hugely challenging. So I just want to be sympathetic to those affected. And I know there's a lot of resources happening right now around groups to consolidate people and get them resources for how they can find their next role. So I want to call that out explicitly up front. Tim, what do you think of this conversation before we jump in?
Great conversation with Brian. It's such a multifaceted issue, how big USDA is, all the different departments, and kind of getting through Farm Bill, crop subsidies, grants, the layoffs, all the above. It was a ton of content to get into, but I think we did a good job working through it.
Yeah, we held our own, but hopefully this is insightful for our listeners. But connect with us on LinkedIn. What did you agree? What did you don't agree on? Would love to just spark some conversation around that, but hope you guys enjoy this conversation with Brian. All right, Brian, you are the poor sap that got chosen or voluntold, I don't know, to come on the podcast. I put out a LinkedIn post last week saying, man, time for an emergency pod. Everything that's going on with DOGE and USDA, I'm seeing every post I think every other post on LinkedIn is related to the cuts going on right now related to DOGE and the USDA. And a lot of it makes sense to me. Some of it doesn't make sense to me. We're being impacted as our farm. And I said, hey, what is a podcast for if not an emergency pod to try to flesh some of this out? So we asked around, hey, who would be a good person to talk to us about this in as objective a way as possible? Hard to do, especially when there's politics involved. But you were referred to us as a great potential guest and candidate. So, no pressure. We're happy to have you on the podcast. Maybe start with a little bit more about yourself, your background, and your current role with Pinion.
Sure. Well, and thank you guys for having me on. I love your podcast, and you do a great service for our industry. So thanks for all that you guys do. So I serve as Director of Government and Public Affairs for Pinion. For listeners who don't know Pinion, Pinion is a national and increasingly global agriculture business advisory company. So we've got 40 offices around the United States. Basically, anywhere there's agriculture, there's Pinion. And we do taxes, we do accounting work. But on business advisory, we have a number of services, one of which is government and public affairs. So I lead our government public affairs team, which does a number of things. We advocate on behalf of farmers and ranchers and food processors. So we run advocacy campaigns. We also gather political intelligence, which is what this podcast is all about. We're trying to share information so that our clients and others in the industry know what's coming and can make smart business decisions, because ultimately government affects us, and we need to understand what government's doing so that we can be smarter in our business.
So, Brian, the big buzz the past couple of weeks has been DOGE going into all the different agencies within the federal government, and USDA being one of them. So there's a lot of changes happening with cuts and grant suspensions and a lot of this. So big topic to get into. So maybe let's kind of get the lay of the land, if you can give us an overview of what's happening currently.
Sure. Well, unless you've been sleeping under a rock, you know that President Trump was sworn into office on January 20th. So we're only a month into the Trump administration, number two, and a lot has happened in that month. You know, typically when a president gets sworn in, one of the first things that's on deck is their cabinet appointments, getting their nominees through Senate confirmation, and that's certainly been taking a lot of time. And has been moving pretty smoothly for President Trump. He hasn't had cabinet secretaries kicked out by the Senate. We had, obviously, Attorney General nominee who's punted, Matt Gaetz. But other than that, it's been pretty smooth sailing. So normally what you would see in a presidential administration is you'd get your secretaries in place, and then the secretaries would start implementing policy. They'd put in their deputy secretaries, et cetera. In this case, it's a little bit different scenario, because at the same time we had all of these Senate confirmed nominees, we also had President Trump appoint Elon Musk and the DOGE boys to run a government efficiency process. And that's been, I think, really confusing for a lot of people, because Elon Musk is not Senate confirmed, so he didn't go through any process. He's heading the Department of Government Efficiency, which is kind of funny because there is no such department. So, like, who is it? What's their mandate? What authority do they have?
It reminds me of like Michael Scott declaring bankruptcy. I declare.
Very much so. It does, in a lot of respects, it does feel a little bit like an Office episode. You know, if the impacts weren't significant. So you've had this bizarre overlay of Elon Musk doing what Elon Musk is doing, and it hasn't been a really good fit, I think, for the way that government normally operates. And maybe that's the point. But I think just in the last 48 hours, we've seen a little bit of a snapback where secretaries of ag, or not just secretary of ag, but secretaries of multiple departments are starting to say, wait a minute, like, we have authority. We're Senate confirmed secretaries, cabinet level. We're going to make the decisions about our departments. And you've seen that with Brooke Rollins as well, where Elon Musk had told all employees that they had to summarize their last week's work. And then just today, Secretary Rollins said, no, ag employees don't need to do that. So I think you're starting to see a little bit of a course correction just in the last couple of days.
So I think a good place to start that's seen a lot of chatter on the internet is around the cuts that were instituted. So there was layoffs happening. From my understanding, a focus on probationary employees, which is kind of a misnomer, because probationary in the context of the government and USDA in particular is kind of like a trial period, but it doesn't necessarily like, hey, you're on probation for doing something wrong. In many cases, it's just standard for that role at the beginning of serving in that role. And in addition, if you get promoted to a new role, so promoted indicating you've done a good job, hopefully, to earn that role, you kind of set off that probationary period again. And so these cuts were kind of seem to be pretty wide ranging across multiple sub-departments, including research, right? So we see a lot of researchers that I'm seeing on LinkedIn that were researching pest and disease for our top commodities, right? As a kind of a national security prevention mechanism. So there was kind of cuts across all these different segments. Can you kind of break down what you saw in terms of the range and the different departments that were cut? And then maybe we can dig into a few.
Sure. So one thing that I think is important for listeners to understand is it's hard to get good information. Like there's a lot of anecdotal information out there on the internet and news articles that have been written, but there's not a great summary that explicitly says what's happened. So what we do know is that for Department of Ag in particular, DOGE announced that they were going to be cutting all probationary employees. We know that in 2024, USDA had about 12,000 employees who had worked there a year or less. So presumably 12,000 probationary employees. And that number could have been higher, as you noted. Some people will work at an agency for 30 years and then become a probationary employee when they get promotion. But potentially very large scale cuts. I mean, we know within the Forest Service, for example, which is one department within the Department of Ag, I think there were 4,500 layoffs. So you certainly could be looking at something on the order of 12,000, but I haven't seen a number that says for sure, here's how many were laid off. But we know that the cuts ran through, you mentioned research. So research labs throughout the federal government or throughout USDA. We've heard FSA offices, huge cuts within Natural Resource Conservation Service. So a lot of offices and expertise that farmers rely on a day-to-day basis. I mean, farm loan officers, we know that FSA offices are habitually short-staffed. Now it sounds like they're going to be shorter staffed. So I think that's one of the big concerns is just how do we make sure these services are available for farmers out where they need them?
Yeah, it's interesting, like interfacing with local FSA offices on our farm. And like when you go in there, sometimes it like feels like you're in the 1980s of like just antiquated processes. And like you see the opportunity of like, we need to digitize this. It could be so much more efficient. But to your point, like still kind of understaffed and they like really haven't been given those resources to make their jobs easier. So it's tough trying to like balance and reconcile this with what's happening. Because if there's more cuts now, it's going to be a little bit even more dysfunctional without the lack of technology and some of the tools at play.
Right. Yeah. And I think the thing that makes that is, I think, a little aggravating for me, I'll be the first to say, yes, government can be bloated and can be inefficient, and we need to make improvements. I think we can all agree with that, especially in the context of ag. Like you said, it is an older agency. I think what's frustrating is typically the way that process would happen would be you'd have a number of players at the table. You'd have the Secretary of Agriculture, who would be doing a performance review of her agency, saying, here's where we're falling down, here's programs that are no longer needed, based on sort of a level of expertise saying this is what's needed for the farmer. That doesn't appear to be what's happened so far, that we had DOGE come in kind of regardless of any need or any needs assessment. It was just sort of across the board cuts, a little indiscriminate. The other thing that's frustrating is the firing of inspector generals that you have within agencies, including within USDA, inspector generals whose job it is to ferret out waste, fraud, and abuse. That's why they exist. That's why Congress created them. And the USDA inspector general had been there for, I don't know, something like 30 years. I mean, she was a long time hand. She knew the agency inside out. She had been there with Republican and Democratic administrations. And she was let go. And that's frustrating because you say, well, that seems to be the person who should be leading this effort. Like they're the ones who really should be ferreting out waste, fraud, and abuse. That's their congressional mandate. And then finally, I do have concerns too, I think, about Congress's role in all of this. Congress can be frustrating. They oftentimes don't get stuff done. I think we all see that as well. But, when you think about cutting an agency like USAID, and I know we're focusing on USDA, but these two relate pretty closely. Congress set up USAID. There's a law saying we should have a foreign aid program, and that buys billions of dollars in farm commodities every year. And so it's troubling that without Congress being involved, that agency apparently is going away, and that's a big impact on farmers. So I think I'm frustrated with the process, not the goal. I think the goals are laudable. Like, okay, yeah, let's tackle waste, fraud, and abuse. Absolutely. But how do you do it? Well, it seems like if you wanted to do it seriously, you'd have the Secretary of Ag leading the effort. It seems like you'd have the Inspector General right at the table. And it seems like you'd be chewing out a role for Congress, who has the power of the purse ultimately.
Totally. And I think this is the crux of the issue or the situation, is that I think that I'm definitely not going to speak for Elon, but I think that the abruptness and the challenge to the standard process is a feature, not a bug for Elon.
Absolutely.
I think that it is intentionally shaking and disturbing the status quo in the system. And I'm not here to say whether that's right or wrong. I think that my read on it is that that's what they're trying to do. And I think it is really helpful context that this is not uncommon in the world of business. And I will say business and government, different. It's not a one-to-one comparison, but it is not uncommon in the world of business where, and we've seen it in dramatic effect over the past several years of layoffs happening across tech, across ag has faced it in particular. And when layoffs happen, there's different methods and approaches, but one is kind of this more indiscriminate cut. It's, hey, we could take 10% cut because we need to for financial reasons or what have you, but maybe that doesn't really solve the problem and there's no changes. So let's take 20 cut, knowing that that's probably too much, but you're going to bring the problems, the needed areas of investment to the surface, right? So this happens. We know this happens. This has happened in companies I've been a part of, companies Tim have been a part of. And I think the biggest criticism of what DOGE is doing, in addition to what you just described of just being different from the status quo and the standard legislative process and governmental process, is these cuts have seemingly not been prescriptive at all.
Right.
They've been indiscriminate. And when you're dealing with farmers and commodities and investment and research, these are like very critical areas that I think you could argue do need that level of prescription of, we need to be much more targeted with the approach. I don't know if Elon's listening, I was like, don't care. That's probably the reality, but I think that's the general consensus of you have to be more prescriptive when there's issues of national security, farmer financial viability, things of this nature.
I 100% agree, and I think that is the nub. And again, I think just in the last week, really, we're seeing a little bit of a change as Secretary Rollins is now in place and can flex her muscle in terms of the agency. We saw her restore a bunch of the Inflation Reduction Act funding that had been cut or frozen, and we saw like the layoffs of the bird flu employees at USDA, where they quickly scrambled to get those people back in their chairs for good reason. So, I'm hopeful that some of this will work its way through the process and that cooler heads will prevail. To me, there's a couple of principles that we should hold to. Number one, the government should be good for its word. If the government enters into a contract with someone and says, I'm going to give you a 3-year grant, and people make decisions based on that, they shouldn't find out 90 days in that grant's no longer there. And, I've got clients all over the U.S., and you can read about it in the paper, of people who, had money to put in a center pivot because of a match from the federal government, and they've put in the center pivot. Now the federal government's like, well, but that funding's on freeze. That's not right. And we all know that's not right. Like, you got to be good for your word. I think the second thing that should be a principle we should all adhere to is, let's be efficient. Let's not waste. And it's troubling to me that, like, with the layoff of probationary employees, these are by definition employees that the federal government has spent huge amounts of money training, bringing in, getting ready to do their jobs. And then we're like, okay, you're now done. And some of those may be really bright, super perfect people for the job. And there are probably other employees who, have been there 20 years and probably it's time to rotate out and get early retirement. And so it doesn't feel like this is necessarily efficient the way it's being done. That, I would like to see where we don't have a brain drain, but we are trimming the fat. And it seems like we can do both.
Yeah, it seems like there's definitely the need for nuance with all the moving parts and interplay within agriculture. You mentioned the grants, like we're the beneficiary of a small grant through the Climate Smart Act, and it's a 3-year grant. And yeah, we have a signed contract for here's what we're going to do over 3 years and abide by the grant. And even for last year, they paid 75% of kind of the 2024 amount, and then 25% was going to be paid this month, and got the update that everything is on pause. So even work that we invested in last year, like, isn't going to get paid out this year. So I get both sides of the story, like being impacted directly as a farm. Like I get trying to cut waste, but to your point, like that's an agreement that's been made with a lot of farmers, and in a really challenging farm economy right now, it hits twice as hard.
Yeah, and I think I would have a much easier time getting my mind around an approach that said, okay, we're not going to issue any more grants of this type. Like we don't agree with climate smart commodities. Just pick that as an example. Philosophically, we don't believe that that's an issue. We don't think it's a priority. We're not going to issue any more grants. Fair enough. That's the job of the president, the job of the administration. Elections have consequences. That's different than saying, okay, we've let a grant and now we're not going to pay it out. And so I think that's one place we need to see a course correction. And again, I was pleased to see Secretary Rollins released, I think it was $11 million in Inflation Reduction Act funding. Remember, Inflation Reduction Act bumped up all of the conservation programs pretty significantly. So you got farmers doing EQIP and CSP and other programs that I think were getting held up. So hopefully some of that is being resolved, because that's just the right thing to do.
I totally agree with that principle, right? Like you have to, and honestly, I don't think we as a country understand the legal implications here. Like, can he not pay out grants that have been approved and agreed to? I don't know if there's an answer to that. Like, does DOGE have that jurisdiction and authority?
Well, and you very quickly get into a big philosophical constitutional question, right? That the executive branch, the president's job under the Constitution is to see that laws are faithfully executed. And it's Congress who writes the law and appropriates the money. And the question is, okay, what happens if the president doesn't do what Congress says and the courts say, well, you got to do it. And the president says, well, I'm not going to do it. It's that Andrew Jackson quote about, well, they don't have an army, let them enforce the law. Speaking of the Supreme Court. Okay. Yeah. But we've gotten this far in our country with a recognition when the courts say something has to be done, we do it, that we respect the rule of law. And I think there was a very real question over the last couple of weeks of, as courts have issued injunctions saying you got to let these funds go, and then the funds wouldn't be let go. Were we seeing willful disobedience to a court order, or were we sort of seeing inefficiency in government? And it's still not entirely clear to me, but I've seen there have been a number of stories where it's pretty clear lower level USDA employees saw the court orders, but said, well, until we get green light from the White House, we don't want to move. And so it might have been government inertia more so than the White House thumbing its nose at the courts. I don't think we know yet which side of that ledger, but it would be really troubling if a court is saying you got to do something. If the White House were saying, I'm going to disobey a lawful order, that would, I think, be something we should all be concerned about.
Totally. Well, Brian, we've chatted layoffs. We've talked in kind of the implications for grant funds being paused. Maybe talk to us a little bit about kind of like current status with the Farm Bill. We haven't talked crop subsidies yet. How do you think about those two areas?
Well, so there's a couple pieces. I mean, number one, obviously farmers want to know about the disaster programs that Congress appropriated last year. We've got two big tranches of money that are waiting to be announced. Secretary Rollins teased just yesterday that she has some big news coming this week. That's my bet. My bet is they're going to announce the disaster programs. We expected it would take them a couple of weeks after she got in office to get those notice of funding availability out the door. So my hope is that we see those dollars announced imminently. That would be a big deal for a lot of farmers around the country, including farmers who were hit by the hurricanes and other disasters. In terms of the Farm Bill, there was a really concerning story just recently about cuts to SNAPs, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and whether that could jeopardize the Farm Bill. And that is concerning to us. Obviously, we want to see a Farm Bill passed. we were very pleased with the bill that the House Republicans passed through committee last year. That was a great farm bill, and in fact included a number of provisions that Pinion lobbied on. One, under current law, LLCs and partnerships are treated differently under the Farm Bill. If you're a partnership, you can get as many farm payments as partners. If you're an LLC, you're only eligible for one payment, and that which is just stupid. And what it does is it penalizes smaller farmers who set up LLCs and don't know any better. So the bill changed that and said, no, we're going to treat LLCs and partnerships the same. It also opened up conservation programs so that larger farmers could participate, which also made sense. Like if you're trying to accomplish a conservation goal, let everyone participate, you're going to get more conservation on the ground. So I think that farm bill is a good bill. It raised reference prices and a number of other pieces that were important for farmers. The concern is if the Republican budget really goes whole hog at cutting nutrition programs, you could lose just enough votes that the farm bill couldn't pass, and that you could lose a couple of Republican votes. You could lose all the Democratic votes. And right now, I mean, today, Speaker Johnson can only afford to lose 2 votes before he can't move legislation. That will get a little bit better with some special elections in April, but it's still going to be 3 or 4 votes that he's going to have to play with. So if we see a big fight break out over SNAP and supplemental nutrition, that could jeopardize our ability to get a farm bill done this year, which would be concerning.
Brian, I want to pivot to the Make America Healthy Again topic of conversation.
Okay.
So, yeah, we're just getting into it here. So I'd like your perspective because I think you have a good one. So Brooke Rollins came on as head of USDA, and we have RFK Jr., who is kind of leading this Make America Healthy Again movement and initiative. How do you see these things like coming together? It seems like there's obvious ways that they're like in direct conflict, and there seems like there's others that there's synergies. And I'm just curious your take on that. Like a few examples would be, RFK Jr. just did a promo video on agriculture and soil health. And focus on kind of regenerative agriculture and healthy foods, right? So how do you see these things playing out, and all of this, I guess, also in the context of cost cutting, right? Because as an example, our farm received funding for a soil health initiative that is being cut. So there's a lot there. You can kind of take it wherever you'd like, but yeah, general thoughts on is it MAHA? Is that how you say it? How do you say it?
MAHA, yeah. Make America Healthy Again. MAHA. Yeah, I mean, so RFK Jr. obviously was confirmed as Secretary of Health and Human Services. HHS does have a little bit of jurisdiction over ag. It oversees the Food and Drug Administration. And one thing farmers should know, the Food and Drug Administration has the authority to go on to farms to inspect farms for reasons related to food safety. So RFK Jr., even though he's not at USDA, he's definitely touching ag. His jurisdiction touches ag. To me, there's a lot of head scratching going on around the world trying to figure out this question. I was talking with a farm group in Ireland earlier today, and they were saying, look, here's the EU leading all these farm to fork initiatives in the EU where they're trying to cut pesticide use and they're trying to cut GMOs, and they've got all sorts of stuff that doesn't work for us as American ag. We want to sell our products into the EU, and if they're setting really limited maximum residue levels for pesticides, or if they're banning certain pesticides outright, it can really affect U.S. ag. So on the one hand, we've had this tension with the EU and more recently with Mexico over GMOs and corn. And on the other hand, now we've got someone high up, a cabinet level official, suggesting, maybe GMOs are causing health issues, or maybe pesticides are causing health issues, and maybe we need to get the American farmer off of pesticides, was his word. And so that, I think it's confusing for a lot of people just trying to figure out which direction we're headed. I'll be the first to say, yeah, we should let science rule the day, right? We shouldn't be scared of answers. We should let science be the driving factor that makes our decisions. But you think about like with Mexico, I mean, here AMLO, the president of Mexico, banned GMO corn, which was a big deal. I mean, Mexico is our largest export market for U.S. corn. AMLO issued a decree saying he wasn't going to accept GMO corn, the U.S. Brought that decision to court under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement that President Trump negotiated in his first term. And we won. And the basis on which we won is his decree was not based in science. The principle that we adhere to is you got to have a scientific basis for what you're doing. You can't just make shit up. And AMLO was just making shit up. He was like, I don't like GMOs. And so it's kind of the same thing with RFK. Like, okay, if you've got really a scientific basis, well, let's see it. But at the same time, you can't be like, I think these things are bad, therefore I'm going to start bad mouthing them, because you can do a lot of damage to people's livelihoods.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's definitely like anxious times. And yeah, it seems kind of like counterintuitive of like on one side, kind of like cutting all the researchers or a lot of researchers on the layoff side, but then also saying like we need to get off these pesticides of like, can't we redirect the focus of some of these researchers to really look at alternatives to really provide that off ramp? Because right now, like there's not a ton of tools in the toolkit for farmers to really like make this transition easily. And I think that's what a lot of farmers are just having heartburn about is like, I would love to not use Roundup or glyphosate, but there's really no alternative right now. So if there was science and alternative products to easily implement, like farmers would do that. Like no one wants to be applying materials that are harmful to consumers or themselves.
Right, and that are expensive. I mean, it's a cost center. So if you don't have to spend the money, you don't want to spend the money. I think it's also important to recognize, though, how we got here. We got here because we need to grow food. We have a growing global population, and it's not. I mean, those numbers just keep going up, and the U.S. literally feeds the world. I mean, 25% of U.S. farm revenue comes from exports to other countries. So it's, and for some commodities, it's even higher. So, on the one hand, yes, we need to be careful and we need to take a science-based approach. And if we can avoid a cost or if we can avoid a health issue, we absolutely should. On the other hand, we don't want to do things that are going to cause food insecurity globally, right? We need to be able to keep producing food. That's what we do. And there is, I think, a real moral imperative that we as American agriculture have to provide food for the world, not just for people in the U.S., but globally. We don't want to see food insecurity. Food insecurity equals pain and suffering. It equals malnutrition. It equals refugee crises. It equals, people coming across borders because they're hungry and they're food insecure. So there's a lot of reasons to continue to focus on agriculture. And USDA a number of years ago came up with a phrase which I really liked, which was sustainable intensification. The idea being that we need to grow more food, so it needs to be intense. We need to be intensifying our food production, more food per acre, but it needs to be done in a sustainable way. We shouldn't be, you can't do things that are going to ultimately cause that system to crash. And that gets to things like soil health and the need for science-based limits on pesticides if they're a problem. But science should be our North Star.
Brian, I would love to just get your perspective on crop subsidies. I think that's been a big topic of conversation of we're subsidizing the commodity crops that a lot of them aren't going to food production, right? The majority of it's going to non-food sources. There's been a lot of talk and chatter about, the implications of that. You just kind of spoke a little bit to national security reasons for some of the subsidies. Like, what are your thoughts on that topic and any implications of all this recent news?
Sure. Well, I think there's a couple things to keep an eye on. Number one, when we talk about subsidies, it's important to understand what we're doing as a matter of policy. Anyone listening to this podcast knows that farming is low margin, high risk industry. You're dealing with weather risks. You're a price taker, not a price maker. You're taking whatever you can sell your commodity for, and you don't control the input costs. There's a lot of reasons for people to not farm. And I think one of the big concerns is, as we have an aging demographic in U.S. ag, are we going to start losing more farmers and losing more farmland? So on the one hand, yes, people don't like subsidies. On the other hand, thinking about safety nets and how to make sure that farming is a viable business, I think is perfectly appropriate and something we should do. The other piece that's, I think, interesting to think about is, President Trump has talked about wanting to see reciprocal tariffs on countries that are charging us more than we're charging them. And on one level, that all makes sense. But on another level, if you look at some of his directives in terms of reciprocity, he wants to go after countries that are subsidizing industries. how long is it before other countries start saying, well, wait a minute, like, are you subsidizing your ag more than we're subsidizing our ag? And, in some respects that can be a healthy discussion, but in other respects, I think you got to be a little careful because, one person's subsidy is another person's safety net. And, at the end of the day, there are farmers, I've got clients who are, work long hours every day, put everything on the line to get in that crop. And then, a derecho hits or a drought hits or a fire hits. And if you don't have the safety net, people lose their farms, they lose their livelihood. And so I think having a robust safety net for U.S. ag is critically important. And that's true not just for the big commodities. I mean, you mentioned, you didn't mention it explicitly, but corn is one that's, grown a lot for fuel. But I think that's true for specialty crops. I think we should be looking across the board at how do we encourage farming, sustainable farming, throughout the United States, and not just the big commodities, but all types of ag production.
Yeah, that's a whole podcast conversation in and of itself to dig into the ins and outs of subsidies. It's pretty interesting just to see the impacts kind of regionally across the U.S. of where that is a bigger deal in the Midwest with row crops versus coming out to California where there's a lot of commodities under significant pressure, like wine grapes being one of them, where there is
Absolutely.
no crop subsidy being available. And like I drive out to our farm and just see vineyards getting bulldozed over and people losing their farms and just a lot of heartache in that particular industry. So in my mind, it like makes sense to give that safety net, but make it kind of uniform so you're serving all farms and not just one class or one group of farmers. But Brian, this has been awesome having you on. I really appreciate the time. As we wrap up, how can our listeners get in touch and connect with you?
Well, you can find us online at pinionglobal.com. That's PINION global.com. And reach out to me through the website if you'd like to talk more about political intelligence or what we're seeing happening with government. But we have teams of people that help with NRCS programs and that help with commodity risk management, crop insurance. So whatever the need is surrounding food and ag, Pinion is there working with your neighbors. So feel free to reach out to us.
So Ty, what do you think of the conversation with Brian?
Yeah, just digesting it a little bit, Tim. I think that it's pretty clear kind of what's happened, why it's happened, the pros and cons of what has transpired. I think there's very clear cons around what's transpired, but I think what I'm most just interested by is how this whole conflict with cutting and efficiency is with this Make America Healthy Again initiative, right? Like, I think that it's just going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Is it going to be an inevitable Rollins versus RFK Jr. clash? Like, and who's going to be the winner? Like, I don't know, but I am got my popcorn ready to see how this all plays out and hoping that farmers don't get burned in the process.
Seriously. Well, we got a bunch of good leads from your post, Ty, so I think we got a few more in the hopper for our unofficial policy series here on the Modern Acre, talking about all things USDA. Just add a new series to the mix, Ty.
Huge policy, guys. Huge policy, guys. All right, guys. Well, thanks for listening. Be sure to make sure you're subscribed to the podcast if this is the first time you're listening. We appreciate you all. We'll talk to you next week.